Okay, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, Physical Assessments in a Virtual-Only World, featuring Prevalent's very own Brenda Ferraro. Brenda is our Vice President of Third-Party Risk. My name is Peter Schumacher. I'll be your webinar host for today, and I've got a couple of housekeeping items just to cover before we officially get started. So first of all, this is a reminder that all attendee lines are muted, and we do that in an effort to cut down on background noise like your dogs barking, kids screaming, toilets flushing, and my favorite this week, your neighbors mowing the lawn in the middle of the day. However, in an effort to keep this session interactive, we do invite you to submit your questions using the Zoom console. Time permitting, at the end of the hour, or towards the end of this hour, we'll address those questions in a Q&A, an official Q&A session. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we plan to deliver that recording to your inbox by tomorrow morning. I know you didn't join to hear my voice, so at this point I'd like to welcome Brenda and turn things over to her. Thanks so much for joining us, and Brenda, please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Today I am thrilled to share with you best practices and an innovative approach to address physical assessments in what we're now living in, the virtual-only world. I'm sure we're all in webinar fatigue, so I'm going to pull in my Say It in 6 training from my days at Charles Schwab and leave some time for questions at the end of the session. My goal is to provide you a somewhat of a podcast approach with this webinar, where there will be slides in the background. So for those of you who like pictures, they are there. But if you feel the need to stretch your legs and walk while I talk, then this is the time to do it. Before we get started, many of you know me, but some of you may not. As Peter had mentioned, my name is Brenda Ferraro. My current role is the Vice President of Third-Party Risk at Prevalent. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about my career because you can find that on LinkedIn. But briefly, my career journey has traveled through retail, financial services, healthcare, and insurance. And that brought me to my passion, of which became third-party risk governance. My purpose in life seems to be, especially while we are navigating our current environmental situation, it's to help companies mature their third-party risk management program and their supply chain programs to reduce risk. As simple as that may sound, building a program, leveraging a solution, and reporting improvements to the board is no easy task. Then throw in a pandemic to test your current program agility and sprinkle in the resilience to pivot and meet existing regulatory requirements, all while adjusting to the new threat vectors. It is inevitably easier said than done. One thing we all have in common across the globe is that we are experiencing how to continue our work fundamentals in one way or another virtually. And no matter what your situation during our current living and working environment, kudos to you. We are doing great due to the circumstances. With our new work from home to work from anywhere lifestyle change, this means the historical on-site visits currently outlined in our programs, policies, and procedures will evolve into virtual assessments. So this webinar will confirm what some companies have already put in place and provide techniques and next steps to improve the programs that have not. Some of us have observed the virtual assessment approach in pockets of the globe. Now it is rapidly taking hold as the most efficient way to validating company controls for assurance virtually. Now, third-party risk management has and will continue to require validation of security controls and physical controls, whatever controls you have that are key controls, to ensure they are effective and enforced, most specifically for critical third parties. And during one of the most recent shared assessment virtual assessments, where they are having an education session hosted by Prevalent, there was a polling question, and the responses came back and reflected that only 36% of the companies in attendance were conducting virtual assessments, and only 28% of the companies have postponed on-site assessments. So here's the thing. testing security controls using on-site visits has become a huge challenge. We were seeing a trend in this direction where on-site visits were coming to a slow end, but thanks to 2020, it has charged the course to the reduction, or in some cases, the finalization of our ease and ability to conduct on-site visits. Now, stronger than ever, with this current environment driving companies to validate security controls, the virtual validation technique is now in play. If you think about it, this isn't so bad, right? Well, only for those of us like me I like to travel. I wanted to go to different countries. I wanted to check up on the third parties to confirm their security control posture. I wanted to experience cultures. I wanted to add those places to my bucket list. But now that travel is limited and in some cases restricted, companies are forced to determine risk validation virtually. For us to focus on what is necessary to successfully conduct a virtual validation, or what others say a bit crazily, virtual on-site, you need to know some very important info. And to determine what the important information is, you need to understand what happened to make this approach springboard to the forefront. Okay, we are seeing business disruption. Social media is driving us to focus on things that we didn't need to act on during our previous 2020 work life. We, of course, are working more remotely. We are using new technologies. We are realizing additional risks. We're requiring new monitoring and mitigation techniques. And all of this is causing proactive companies and companies in survival mode to reinvent their work practices. The way third-party risk has been impacted is not only in the inability to provide management better understanding on third-party impact by way of delayed services and or products, but also the unfortunate cases are proving that the inability to perform the service or deliver the product. We're seeing a trend where third-party risk management programs are reinventing how they are facing end-to-end risk management. We're really facing this invisible COVID threat that's made companies basically look at how are they doing their business? What risks are they putting into place? What testing protocol has to happen? And what do we need to shift? In the record books somewhere, maybe the Smithsonian, we have found some early adopting companies who have been using the virtual assessment technique probably since 2003. Some companies have short-sighted themselves by thinking, hey, if I go virtual, I can't cover the physical controls. Or if I go virtual, it is impossible to validate certain controls that I've been validating before. If I go virtual, only procedural or policy controls can be reviewed. If I go virtual, there's a security risk by using a web video or an audio conference capability. And lastly, if I go virtual, there will be a loss of controls to protect my artifacts and evidence of which could place my company at risk. But never fear, these are myths that not only shared assessments, but Prevalent and other companies have debunked. The reality is that there are platform techniques and technologies that can bridge the manual physical inspections. And controls can be evaluated virtually by looking at evidence libraries and subsequently deep diving into reviews to provide risk identification and tracking. Starting with risk summary information gathered during either threat intelligence reporting and or questionnaire assessment content gathering, we then can have a collaboration platform that can take the risk assessment outputs and set expectations to support online validation reviews. And access controls in some platforms can provide the visibility into artifacts and documents necessary to perform the virtual assessment. Now, virtual assessments are going to be our new way, if not already, to validate controls for the foreseeable future. The great news is that virtual assessments typically take less than half the time to complete. The cost of the assessment is only half the staff hours with no travel expense. And there are ways to repurpose inside out and outside in intelligence to drive the relevant scope for the virtual assessment to be conducted. Ultimately, harmonizing the trusted intelligence with the verification of the threat intelligence, and finally, with the validation testing results. So what we're realizing today is adopting virtual assessments will have 3 phases in their journey to master the virtual approach. And Shared Assessments has shared this and goes into much more detail, but at a very, very high level, at least for companies who are not conducting virtual assessments today, these companies are already well into the immediate phase. They have figured out how to manage the risk virtually. They have started to document the assumptions and maybe even have started to test it out. The areas the companies have started to look at in some of the fundamentals, such as how to scope the virtual assessment. You don't need or want to perform a review or look to test the protocols on every single unfavorable thing that is asked or scanned in either a questionnaire or reflected in a threat intelligence report. And companies should have a list of key controls that are must-haves to determine the risks of which in turn will require mitigation. And in cases where threat intel is included, if the information from the third party either is identified as an unfavorable response and is reflected in a risk on the threat intelligence report, that, my friend, is a confirmed residual risk that needs to be virtually validated for high risks. Therefore, virtual validation assessment scope is determined by the questionnaire responses or both the questionnaire response and the threat intelligence validation. As for vendor classification, the companies have most likely started to look at the classification model to make sure their tiering approach still applies with the new remote work environment. You might hear something in the future known as the Internet of Work, as a subset of the Internet of Things. You didn't hear it first from me here. You might have heard it from somewhere else, but I do think I made that up at one point or another. There are 4 third-party risk management program factors that will most likely require modification. And they include adjustment to your current policy. So the TPRM programs are going to need to apply document exceptions for their third parties that at one time required on-site risk assessments. You can possibly look to use offshore staff located in the region if and only if that office is open for visitors, and in the event an on-site assessment is mandated. But you can also take your current TPRM policy and maybe that might require upper management approval to allow for compensating controls to avoid audit findings, yet still attend to the risk management protocol. Secondly, risk exception or disposition handling will change. What will happen here is that periodic reviews of the policy will need to stipulate that the exception or disposition protocol will need to adjust to allow for the compensating controls to be used. Due to the wavering environment, some companies will opt to create an addendum to their policy rather than holistically embed the modification. So you'll see that happening as a second fundamental. Now, thirdly, the frequency of the reviews will change. It's going to be really important to make sure that the scope of the virtual assessment is fit for purpose. In other words, most companies will conduct a virtual assessment scope and they will test the critical or high risks only. The key point for this is that the virtual assessment scope must match the company key controls and risk tolerance. And finally, corrective action requirements may need to be adjusted. Risk ratings are going to shift a bit. Your TPRM team will need to take a look at your current outstanding risk items, and some of them may need to be reprioritized or re-ranked, of which may end up causing risk items to be either closed because they're not a risk anymore, or a new risk might be created. So when looking at a solution or a process to fit your risk adjustments, it's highly advised that you use a technique or a functionality that allows you to bulk update and bulk modify your risks with applied justification. For example, pretend you have 5,000 vendors and you identified a single risk that required a modification to either be closed or adjusted. You would not want to go in manually and update each of those risks for those 5,000 vendors if it applied. What you want to be able to do is take that manual burden away from your skilled staff, because they're going to be wanting to attend to risks rather than update the risks, and then bulk update that information. And finally, the communication mechanism is the key point. You're going to want to tell the vendors and your business units that those risks have changed, and they want to make sure that they're prioritizing the mitigation of those risks to what the true risk is of today. Now, this chart is a conglomerate of 6 areas of items that you will need to take a look at. Programs are going to adapt to these expectations in efforts to manage their risks virtually. And for companies that are challenged with planning and preparation, they're going to face struggles to adopt this fundamental virtual adoption. Briefly, there are 6 core components with multiple subcomponents that are changing. If we look at the standard questionnaires, there will be a new focus on things such as removing questions that are no longer relevant, identifying disconnects and gaps as to what questions are not asked today that need to be asked now because of the new risk landscape, for example, work from home. If company tiers have changed, the communication process with internal and external constituents will need to be informed on how the assessment has been modified to reflect, reduce, or remove, or add a risk. And a process will need to be implemented on how to apply the new questionnaire content and or risk identifiers to an existing or a new third party. Now, if we move into the second core component of scoping the virtual assessment, there are at least 4 scoping parameters. Questionnaire content gathering has always been referred to as the trust portion of the process. Questionnaire responses inform us on the third-party interpretation of their control posture. In the event you are using an automated solution that provides pre-configured risk scoring and pre-configured risk mitigation guidance, this will help to narrow the risk domains that require validation using the risk summary report as an output. Automation and configuration of a solution to reflect relevant risk control domains will assist in proper risk identification based on service or product engagements. Now, if you look at the scoping from a perspective of how to integrate the new controls due to work from home, for example, in an automated solution, you should be able to flex the risk management capabilities with ease of change. Once the questions are added or removed and the risks are added or adjusted, you may find there will be some third parties that will require a full reassessment. However, this scenario may only be applicable to a minimal critical subset of your third-party portfolio, so don't go crazy. The use of subcontractors has received a beacon of laser focus, and a platform that provides spider diagrams on vendor relationships will help you to determine how to narrow or broaden your assessment. Should it reach wide or just for an individual based on the fact that you're following the data and or business impact. Now, if we move into document requirements, of course, every company has rhyme or reason as to what artifacts or documents can be shared as evidence, whether it be online or stored in a network. The fundamental factor in this component is that you will need to know the third-party requirements and policy of their sharing capabilities of information prior to setting up and conducting the assessment. What is really nifty in this aspect is that if you have a solution that provides a risk summary report highlighting the items that will be included in the virtual assessment, your solution can then trigger to set up expectations of what else needs to be gathered. And furthermore, when the testing protocol takes place during that virtual assessment, those findings of risks should be harmonized with what you receive from the questionnaire responses and what you see in the threat intelligence report to reflect a holistic end-to-end trust, verify, validate risk. Now, as mentioned earlier, planning is one of the most important aspects to successfully conduct a virtual assessment. Without it, all sorts of things can go wrong, making the virtual experience painful for both you and your third party, and we don't want that. So if you use a risk summary report, as I had mentioned before, and that could be your template to provide the details on what to expect, highlight the high risk items that you're going to test, give them examples of what you're going to want them to provide to you. And it's very simple. We can have project management skills of the resource that is required to navigate the virtual assessment fulfillment. And some companies are reaching out to managed services to perform the virtual assessment on their behalf. All in all, the pre-assessment setup is all about expectation setting on both sides of the house. As for virtual collaboration, when the company is required to look at how to screen share, do know that using a solution with role-based access will remove the need to use either SharePoint or other documentation storage systems. Many companies will send out pre-meeting communication embedded in their meeting invites, yet those companies that have automation techniques can use pre-configured email templates, reminders, and schedules. With regards to risk management, that is actually our hidden middle name for each and every one of us on this call. I should be known as Brenda Risk Management Ferraro. Specifically, as the component changes to reflect, this is pointing to the process of risk identification, validation, tracking, adjustment, and reporting. Using an automated solution that is flexible will help you to make these changes and make your life not only easier, but also transparent for you and your third parties and your nth parties. Now, outside of the fundamentals we explored today, I want to give you a simple high-level virtual assessment process. This is to help you identify what is required to change from on-site to virtual. First, make sure you're using a solution that has automation capabilities. Automate the collection and automate the risks and automate the risk recommendations in your questionnaires. Use standards or networks or exchanges that can repurpose what's already been collected. For threat intelligence, there are many companies that have cyber, but we're also noticing that business intelligence is just as important. Make sure you're looking at your tiering and your profiling, what key controls apply to your company, and configure those risk remediations as guidance so that it cuts down on the back and forth. Now, as you're starting to gather that information in the profiling, include your nth party transparency. Identify who they're working with, follow the data, follow the impact. Use an automated risk summary report that can tell you exactly what the high risks are and what testing protocol is going to be expected. Use that as your scoping template. When you go to conduct the virtual assessment using, of course, the skill of a project manager, they will look at the plan, do, check, act, and they will set up the access rights, if not already done so, within your automated platform or using email if you decide that that's the route you're going to take. What's most important after you conduct that virtual assessment is to harmonize the risk. If the questionnaire says it's a risk, but the threat intelligence also says it's a risk, and then you validate it with your testing protocol, make sure you have the ability to harmonize that information so that you're making it very easy for the third party to know how to prioritize what needs to be mitigated and what compensating controls are appropriate for you. Distribute a final risk report to not only your business units, but also your external constituents in the third party as well. Show them that this is the actual risk intel that we want you to remediate and by when. And then of course, continuously evaluating and reporting. Track those risks to closure, adjust the risk based on triggered events, and reflect that status in your key risk and key performance indicator reports. So I hope I've done it justice where you've now had a webinar fatigue experience in a podcast format where we have set it in 6. I am going to now hand it over to Peter. He will have a polling question and then we can open up for Q&A.
Thanks, Brenda. Yes, here we go, launching a poll. So this will pop up in a second for you guys, but it says, are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the next several months? So yes, no, or you're not sure. I'll leave that up for you guys to answer. And in the meantime, we do have a number of questions that have come in. So Brenda, let me start reading a couple of those to you, and then we'll hear your comments on those. So the first thing that did come in was, how do you transition from third-party risk assessor to third-party risk governance? And there's actually a second part to that question, but we'll stop there for now. So how do you transition from third-party risk assessor to third-party risk governance?
Great. So really it's migrating from assessor to a risk manager to a governance program. So governing programs are those that keep track of key risk indicators and performance indicators and constantly regulate those items per the guidance of frameworks and guidelines. So when you're governing something, you're making sure that your engine is working, your people are doing what they can do, you're assessing the items that are to protocol and to your objectives and your goals. So you move from an assessment is reviewing content. A risk manager is making sure they're tracking the risks to closure. And then a governing perspective of a program is when you're able to keep track of those key performance and risk indicators, and you govern the policies and the procedures and the protocols to fruition.
Great. And second part of that question, so how do you transition your teams, as you once put it in the Shared Assessment Summit a few weeks back, into risk hunters? How do you transition your team into risk hunters?
Yeah, risk hunters. I'm going to get everybody
Don't even remember saying it, do you?
No, I do. I say things a lot, and everybody reminds me. So from a risk hunting perspective, when you're going through reviews and assessments and you're identifying your inherent risk, and you're then seeing what's residual risk based on your key controls, basically those nets and traps for your risk hunters is your key controls. Those key controls are specific to what you want in place in order to do business with any third party, fourth party, or nth party. And it's not only related to your questionnaire. Those key controls should also apply to your threat intelligence, and it also should apply to how you do your validation control testing. Now, if I'm a risk hunter, there's going to be different triggers of events and incidents that will happen. And in order to find risk hunters and make sure that you're using that appropriately in your third-party risk management staff, it's very advisable for you to start looking at your metrics. Your key risk indicators will identify an incident scenario-based test that you should test out. And not only will you find risks within how you are handling, hosting, processing, physical securing your data, but you'll also find that you have risks in your policies and your procedures that you need to shore up. They're very fun to do, and it becomes something where every time you do it, even if once a quarter, you'll identify at least 20 to 21 items that you will need to fix and test out the next time. So from a risk hunting perspective, outside of Security Operations Command Center, those are the things that I would advise.
Great. 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 more questions, and then I also invite everyone to add to that list. So here comes some more. So let me start at the top. How do you determine key controls for assessments? I.e., is it prioritizing which controls or high priority?
Now, large companies normally have a key control process where they have a steering committee and they talk about risks based on the metrics that they're finding from their universe and portfolio. For those companies that don't have that, there's 2 ways that you can approach it. There's sharing of information from ISACs for your community of industry. Many of them will have a starting point of here's where we're seeing the most impact. I've seen key controls range anywhere from 5 key controls all the way up to 60 or 75 key controls. And normally those fall into their must-haves. If you didn't have them in place at your own facility, then you wouldn't expect someone else to have them. And if it's something that they must do in order to play in the sandbox with you, then those are the ones that become key controls. I wouldn't fear starting out with the perfect key control list. Start out with something. You might be able to get something from your peers in third-party risk. They can share with you what they've started with. Go ahead and take those, and then once you have gone through a quarter, you will need to adjust them. They are always living and breathing, and that's why it's important to have a flexible solution that can adjust with your key controls so that you're constantly keeping into play continuous evaluation and the threat challenges that ebb and flow. So that was that part of the question. Did I answer all of that, Peter? Was there another one?
I think that's it for that question, but we've got some others.
Okay.
So we'll move on to the next one, which is asking you to pull out your crystal ball. And do you think virtual assessments will become the new normal since it really helps the budget? And if you say no, how do you continue to justify on-sites when COVID blows over?
Oh my gosh, so you're kind of pulling at my heartstring because I love to travel. I believe that virtual assessments are going to be more of the preferred approach, especially when we don't know what's going to happen down the road with COVID. Many companies, like I said in the beginning of this podcast webinar, was that if they are allowing people to come on site, we're finding that managed services in that region is doing the work. So it's not like someone from the US is going to fly over to the UK, for example, to do that assessment. They're hiring people who are of that region. There's restrictions right now. I don't know when those restrictions will be lifted of where people from the US can go. So I would just hope and cross my fingers that maybe the highest critical risk ones you would be able to go on site, but just think of it from an out of box perspective. Whatever's more effective, whatever's more uncostly, and whatever's safe for you is the approach to take.
Makes sense. Next question is, how do you communicate to your third party that you are performing an assessment versus an audit when you mentioned testing controls?
Yeah, you have to be very careful of that. So in your contracts, you should have a stipulation that states that they can be audited annually. Audits are more of like the AICPA firms or an internal audit or an external audit. When you have assessments, make sure that you're using the word assessments and use the word testing security controls appropriate to the risks identified in your assessment. That way they know that you're not coming and doing a full-fledged holistic security review. You're really pointing at the risk summary report template that tells them here are the risks that we will be testing and or evaluating. You could use different words from the thesaurus, but you're actually going to be doing some testing protocols and they need to know that that will happen. So I would just be careful with your words. Use the word evaluation, use testing with it wrapped with the word assessment, and make sure you're very pointed on it's specific to the risks that were identified versus everything under the sun.
Good point. Several more questions here, so we'll get right to it. But in the meantime, I just wanted to mention again that this is being recorded and we're going to send the recording out tomorrow morning. So look forward to that in your inbox. I'll grab a question from the chat. They've come in via the Q&A section and the chat. So from the chat, we've got, what are key controls that should be tested for vendors with employees working from home?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so you probably had some controls that were already being looked at, such as, do they have specific network access? Are they controlled on their laptop? Are they logging into your systems at your castle? What kind of Wi-Fi do they have? Are they able to put applications on their laptop? There's a slew of them. I would recommend looking at the Shared Assessment Standard questionnaire for some of those controls, and then identify, just from a key control perspective, just make sure that you're identifying that there are work from homes holistically, or whoever's going to be touching, hosting, handling that data. For example, what if someone's creating an application from their home, but they've got some kind of system that they're not plugging into your protected network? They're using something outside. So it really depends, and I'm sorry I have to say that, but if you have specific questions, feel free to email me or email the info@prevalent.net, they'll get that question to me for specifics, and we might be able to share with you some approach for those key controls.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that info.prevalent.net email address is up on your screen now on the slide, and I will field those requests as they come in. I have access to that, so I can field your questions to the appropriate resource here, whether it's Brenda or someone else. Next question is, how do you move from spreadsheet questionnaires, which you are very adept at, to automated questionnaires when your attempts to shoehorn your questionnaire into existing GRC platforms that can be very clunky and lots of wasted consulting money aside?
Yeah. So being that I built a third-party risk program, I as well started with spreadsheets. And it is a change that you just have to rip off the Band-Aid and say, look, I'm not going to do this spreadsheet back and forth anymore. Number one, it's not secure. And number two, it's not healthy for the third party to not have it applicable in some networks or exchanges. So what I recommend is you get together with a company that can do the managed services to your needs. You may be using a standard from a SIG, the Standard Information Gathering Questionnaire, or you may be using your own proprietary question. And what I normally recommend, no matter if you use a consultant or who you go with, is you take your current information and you bump that up against a standard, and you identify if there's a higher than 75% match. And if there is, then you should migrate to a standard so that you can reap the benefits of other companies that are also using that standard. For example, we have a Prevalent Control Framework questionnaire. Same thing applies. If we have a customer that comes to us and says, look, we have this proprietary questionnaire, we want to use the PCF, can you please do a bump up and let us know what the delta is? And then create supplementals. So if there's something that's missing from a standard, don't fear using a standard or using a product that already has the standard adopted in their platform. You can always add a supplemental, and that supplemental questionnaire is specific to your company. It can be packaged together so that your vendor gets all the information collection at one time, and then it can be shared appropriately to whatever business unit you want that to go to. So really what happened for me from experience is I just had to say, you know, this is what I'm going to go with. You can do an assessment yourself to identify how easy it is with a platform. If it's a GRC system such as Archer or ServiceNow, I do know that those can become a bit cumbersome. I do recommend that you look at platforms that API with those GRCs, because there are workflow engines that are capable in other platforms outside of the GRCs, but do confirm that the GRC intelligence and attributes can be shared across those two solutions. So that if you have an enterprise that's looking at ServiceNow, for example, or Archer, for example, they can still reap the benefits of the engine of Prevalent, for another example. So hopefully that answers your question. Usually a workshop will take care of those, but do know that, yes, it can become cumbersome, it can be costly, and if you put the requirements in place and you give and take a little bit without reduce or impacting your risk, then you should be fine.
Thanks, Brenda. Next question is, should a virtual physical security assessment include a picture or video evidence along with a questionnaire? This is an interesting one. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so GoPros, FaceTime videos, you can always use what's at your fingertips. So don't be afraid to say, I would like to do a physical walkthrough. I need you to take your iPhone or your GoPro and record or show me as I'm watching you walk through. It's like you're just there, but you're there from a virtual aspect. So don't fear doing that. From a perspective of recording and storing, of course, you're going to have to ask that company of their policy and what things you're able to record and store. But if you're asking specifically on a questionnaire and filling out a questionnaire on their behalf, I do want you to know that no company should be completing a questionnaire on the behalf of another company without that call being recorded and for them to be responding to what needs to be entered, so that it's very clear that the responses are coming from the third party or the fourth party or the nth party and not being interpreted by the company who is helping them to complete that questionnaire if they're not able to do that holistically themselves.
Great. And next question is, what are your thoughts on relying on SOC reports for physical site assessments? And does that meet the definition of a qualified third party?
Okay, so SOC reports have been around for a very long time. SOC 1s and SOC 2s are different. One's more financial focused, the other one is security focused. Most of the SOC reports are defined by engagement, so make sure that you're getting a bridge letter for those SOC reports to be shared with you so that you know that the engagement intelligence that you're receiving from that SOC report is also pertaining to the engagement that you have. I normally, and this isn't something that everybody does, but I would advise that you, if they give you a SOC report and that's the only thing that you're using, that you ask them to summarize the risks that were identified and put a summary of the engagement. That way you don't have to dig deep into the plethora of pages and try to identify exactly what's being identified and hit. And that way you can then, if you have a platform or a solution or something that you're tracking the risks on, you can then create risks to track based on that summary document versus the SOC 2 or the SOC 1 holistically. So I would say that a third party that's providing services to you, you're going to want to see the SOC 2, but I have never in my career used the SOC 2 as the holistic item to identify risk, based on the fact that there are variables on the engagement, on the shareability, and potentially could put me at a misrepresentation of what the risk really is to my company.
Thank you. A couple more questions remain. You'll notice that survey is still up. I think most everyone has filled it out, but there's a couple of you that haven't. So if you didn't notice the survey up there, please answer yes, no, or you're not sure, and then I'll leave you alone. But next question for Brenda is, how large a company do you have to be in order to do on-site virtual assessments?
Any size. It really is more about what are the risks that need to be assessed. So if your risk is a critical risk and you're either the vendor or the assessor, they're going to assess you virtually no matter what. So if you're doing high risk value product or service delivery, no matter what your size is, you will be virtually assessed if that's the case, if it's mandated in their policy. And if you are a company of small size that identifies high risks that could make a huge, enormous impact to your business, I would recommend you do a virtual review and assessment of those third parties that have high risks. So size doesn't matter.
All right, I'll keep my comments to myself on that.
I know. I thought about that.
Thanks for teeing it up though, Brenda, appreciate it. So actually 2 more questions. Last call for questions. So if you do have a burning question, throw it up here on the chat. And I'll move on to this one. How do you approach the validation portion of an assessment traditionally completed during an on-site assessment to now being performed virtually? And that's to say SME walking assessor through network device configurations to validate hardening activities or a data center walkthrough?
Yeah, so there's really good ways to do that, whether you could use Teams or Zoom. I know that Zoom has the capability of doing breakout sessions. So you're able to say, okay, we're going to have the subject matter expert for this particular component section go over to this breakout room, and they're going to go through and do the virtual walkthroughs and validations and the testing protocols over on another in another area while another group of people are working on something else, maybe their encryption or their physical walkthrough or something to that effect. What I want to make sure that you understand is that the most important thing is to have the scope and to set the expectations, let the third party or fourth party know what you're going to be asking them for. And then the project manager or whoever is going to be facilitating that virtual assessment, whether it's your risk manager or your assessor or managed services or a partner, then they're going to want to go in and look at, okay, here's how we're going to divide and conquer. And here's what we're going to expect them to do based on the fact that we're not going to be there in person, so that it's very easy. The other thing that can happen is some companies are looking to have a virtual assessment review with more than one company. So what I used to see in the past is we would have, even at my former company, we would have 20 of our larger companies come and look at us, and we would have our subject matter experts do presentations and show what needed to be shown. Everybody got their answers at the same time, and then if there was anything that was an output or subsequent to that, then they would go into an off room or a breakout room to discuss it or schedule something else further down the road. So you can also do that to kind of close down how many times you're hit with virtual assessments. You can say every quarter, on the 15th of the mid-month of the quarter, we set aside a day. You will be able to listen to how we protect and are postured in our maturity, showing you what we have been requested to show from a virtual perspective. And everybody gets to watch at the same time as if they were an audience in a room. And then you can have breakout rooms to answer subsequent questions if they arise. But normally those work, and it helps to cut down on cost, transparency, and effectiveness.
Great, thanks. Good answer. A few more have come in, so we'll keep going. Looks like folks are sticking with us. So we're not boring anyone yet, Brenda, so good work.
Good.
Is a virtual assessment the same as a questionnaire?
A virtual assessment can be used as a questionnaire. So for example, in Prevalent, if you have a questionnaire and you identify a risk and that maps up to a threat intelligence risk, then you're going to want to harmonize the information in the virtual assessment. In shared assessments, they have what's known as a security control assessment. That is a Excel capability, and then it produces a report. What we prefer to do at Prevalent is using that format as an example, whatever the findings are, we would document everything in the platform and then make sure that the information is harmonized. So it could be its own separate questionnaire for those who want to use it holistically and singularly, but then you also want to think about, if it is populated into a platform, how those risks are harmonized and how the final report is produced internally and externally, so that you're really working on those risks. So the answer short is it can be, and the answer long is what you just heard.
Nice. Okay. Thank you. All right. 2 more questions, I promise, and then we'll be close to the top of the hour anyway. So how long should a virtual assessment be in comparison to a physical site assessment? Or does it depend?
It does depend, and it's going to depend on scope. What I'm recommending is that you really focus on what your key control high risks are and what's going to impact your business if they don't have something in place. Once that you have all of your inventory of profiled vendors and universe assessed to a point of satisfaction, then of course you can start looking at adding medium risks, or in the event that a medium risk bubbles up to a high risk, then that would be a continuous evaluation ad hoc check. So don't think of virtual assessments as one and done as well. Virtual assessments can happen at any time based on threat intelligence or questionnaire or triggered incidents or pandemics. So for example, I would probably, if it were me that owned or was a director or a VP over third-party risk, would have evaluated my portfolio of vendors and said, okay, these 5 to 10 companies, maybe at minimum, are ones that are critical to our business. And now that we know that they're working virtually, or we know that they're not able to provide services, or they're not able to provide a product, we need to go and review them very rapidly from a virtual assessment perspective. But what would be important, just from my outlook, is that whatever you do create or provide, from an SCA perspective, those are shareable. So those security control assessments from shared assessments are ones that can be shared across engagement to engagement. So you might be able to take into effect some of the controls that were already virtually validated, and then add your deltas and make it very simple so that you're not taking too much time. So yes, it does depend on whether you're reusing a virtual validation that has been accomplished before, if it matches the engagement and controls that you're looking to view, and just kind of put a lens on it as, is it important to me and is it fit for purpose? And if it's not reusable or fit for purpose, then you're going to be starting from scratch on your high risks for validation.
All right. Last question here, and then we'll let everybody go. Are there any tips on telling the board how great the assessment team is maintaining the vital TPR function through the current work from home situation? And there's a smiley face in the question too.
Yes. So there's a couple things that you can do. The first one is Prevalent has a maturity assessment. And what we do is we look at your program as a whole, and you can use that to say, hey, board, look how great we're doing. From there, the second thing is that if you have key performance indicators and key risk indicator reports, those can also go to the board, and you can segregate out the work from home components. So not only can you say, here's what we're doing from a holistic universe profile perspective for our third parties and nth parties as well, if you're adding your nth parties, but also you could say, for this threat vector of work from home, here's how we are tracking risks and closing those risks by timeline. So you can see the ebbs and the flows of the peaks and the valleys of time of when things are going to close based on the dates that you've set for those closures. Also, you've got those, you will hopefully have a platform that has chasing emails to remind not only your business units, if they're in charge of owning those risks, or your third-party risk staff, if they own the risks, along with the vendors that own closing the risk. You could give them email notifications in advance to say, oh, in 30 days, you're supposed to have this done. Does everything look like you're going to have it finished? And if not, let us know, because we want to make sure you don't get put on the naughty list that goes up to our steering committee or our boards. And then normally they will be very proactive, because you're helping them to remember, with all the other work that they're doing, that this is something else that needs to be put on their plate as a priority. So I would just basically say, use the maturity assessment, use your KRIs and your KPI reports, and then use email templates that can be scheduled to remind not only your company, but the third party or fourth party that things are coming into play very rapidly or in the future that need to be addressed.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Brenda. And I think you're supposed to be known as Brenda Risk Management Ferraro. Is that right? Is that what we're supposed to call you?
Everybody on this call has the middle name Risk Management now.
Risk Management. Okay, everyone. Great. I don't want that, but I'll take it.
We'll say
all right. Well, if we haven't gotten to your question, I think I got to most all of them. If I missed it for whatever reason and it's a burning question, again, send an email to info@prevalent.net. We'll get an answer for you. Appreciate you taking that poll I had up there. And thank you again, Brenda. Thank you, everyone else, for time today. And we look forward to talking to you on the next webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you. Be safe.